humanitarian pause that was brokered by the state of Qatar and the United States has been of great concern to Ghana. We are equally worried about the challenge of committing to the spirit of the humanitarian pauses and the obligation to preserve civilian lives and infrastructure, which makes a humanitarian ceasefire more necessary now, as called for by the Secretary General. It is in that regard that we welcome the decision by the Secretary General to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter, which has only been invoked 4 times in the over 7 decades of history of the United Nations, the last time being in 1989. We note that the ongoing Israeli-Hamas conflict has unfortunately taken a heavy toll on the civilian population on both sides and consequently created a serious security and humanitarian crisis, not only in Gaza, but also in Israel and the other occupied Palestinian territories. It is regrettable that civilians and non-combatants, especially those residing in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Israeli communities along the border with Gaza, are bearing the brunt of the violence. We are concerned that the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza has rapidly worsened in the last few days. Unfortunately, the use of heavy weaponry and the bombardment of Gaza has made it extremely difficult for humanitarian actors to have access to many of the internally displaced people, including the aged, pregnant women, and children who face significant challenges, including limited access to essential services such as healthcare, clean water, and electricity. Ghana, like all the other delegations, is worried about the decision by the Israeli government to expand its ground operations to cover all parts of the Gaza Strip. The decision puts the lives of the civilian population in the densely populated Gaza Strip at serious risk. We note that the destruction of critical infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, exacerbates the suffering of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. We join in the appeal by the Secretary General and all Council members for both Israeli security forces and Hamas to prioritize and put in adequate measures to protect civilians on both sides, as per the principles of international humanitarian law governing the legal use of force in an armed conflict. The ongoing war presents complex security and humanitarian concerns that require immediate attention by this Council. The security concerns of both Israel and the Palestinian people must be addressed. International cooperation, direct diplomatic negotiations, and a commitment by both Israel and Palestinian Authority to engage in frank dialogue are essential to address the underlying causes of the conflict and for achieving lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. The security of Israel and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for their homeland lies in a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the pre-1967 borders with Jerusalem as the shared capital. We call on Council members with moderating influence on both Israel and Hamas to use all means possible to heed the calls of the international community for steps leading to peace and an eventual settlement of the conflict. In closing, we wish to reiterate our long-held belief that it is only through a comprehensive and inclusive approach that the Middle East question can be settled. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
I thank the Presidency for convening this open briefing upon the timely request of the United Arab Emirates and the Russian Federation. I thank the Secretary General for his important briefing. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is appalling and without precedent. Secretary General Guterres, for the first time since the beginning of his tenure, invoked Article 99 of the Charter to address this Council. And it is not that the world has been spared from serious conflicts elsewhere since then. We commend the Secretary General's initiative, which convenes another express call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Appeals for a humanitarian ceasefire from the international community, the United Nations, humanitarian actors, and also by all members of this Council have justifiably multiplied over the past weeks after more than 2 months of conflict. An urgent ceasefire is even more needed now since the resumption of hostilities. The conflict has brought the humanitarian system in support of civilian lives in Gaza to the point of total and unprecedented collapse. Over 80% of Palestinians in Gaza were uprooted from their homes and are becoming ever more deprived of the minimum necessary to survive. These conditions are unacceptable. We recall Brazil's efforts in this Council since the very beginning of the crisis, including during its presidency. Our draft resolution was supported by the vast majority of Council members, but was vetoed by a permanent member, as was the case with other drafts. Our proposal called for immediate humanitarian pauses, among other provisions. If adopted on that occasion, thousands of lives would have been saved. Brazil also spared no efforts in joining the international initiatives in support of a humanitarian ceasefire and to ensuring the protection of civilians. We are being constantly reminded that there is no safe place in Gaza. The repetition of this extremely worrying statement, compounded by the increasing and devastating human toll prompted by the conflict, constitutes another wake-up call to this Council. We must step up and act responsibly to respond to this unfolding tragedy. The dramatic humanitarian situation leaves us with no alternative. We need an immediate halt in hostilities for as long as necessary, allowing for proper humanitarian action. The provisions of Resolution 2712, recently adopted by this very Council, must be fully implemented. In the absence of this, we, particularly those responsible for any failure, risk complicity and a very negative judgment by history. It is difficult to express the frustration that many of us continue to feel. That frustration is not just with Council inaction. We urge all those with power to influence the key stakeholders to allow for the necessary conditions for a meaningful action by the Council. Mr. President, once again, it is necessary to reiterate that obligations under international law, and especially international humanitarian law, must be respected in any conflict. We recall the need to act according to the principles of distinction, proportionality, necessity, and humanity. The protection of the civilian population and civilian infrastructure is an obligation under international humanitarian law, as is the prohibition of forcibly displacing civilians or the taking of hostages. We reiterate the call to allow access to hostages to the International Red Cross. All this, unfortunately, applies to the current hostilities in Gaza. There can be no politically and morally justifiable attitude towards the growing tragedy in Gaza, other than working to protect civilian lives now and keep up the pressure for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held captive. We members of this Council have more than a moral imperative now. We need to do what is in our reach to stop this humanitarian catastrophe. Failing this task would likely result in a scenario where the authority and legitimacy of the Council would erode even further and prove its incapacity to discharge its duties according to the United Nations Charter, to the detriment of world peace and security, as we can see in these days. As a consequence of all said, we will vote in favor of the draft resolution tabled by the UAE for a vote this afternoon, and we co-sponsor it. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I will now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Ecuador. To start, I would like to thank the Secretary General for his intervention this morning and reiterate the support of Ecuador for his work and for the work of the entire UN system in these difficult times. Last Wednesday, for the first time in over 30 years, Article 99 of the Charter was invoked that allows the Secretary General to draw attention of this Council to any issue which, in his judgment, can threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. He did that in the face of the scale of the loss of human lives in Gaza and Israel in the 2 months that have passed since the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. He did it because the situation is deteriorating rapidly and to avoid it leading to a total collapse, a disaster with consequences that could be irreversible for peace and security in the region. Your Excellencies, colleagues, Ecuador has clearly condemned in unequivocal way the unjustifiable and horrific terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, as well as to demand that all hostages be liberated immediately and unconditionally. We've done this on many opportunities in various forums, and we would like to do it today once again. Also, we'd like to clearly recall that the Palestinian people have an inalienable right to free determination and to legitimate aspirations of living in security, freedom, justice, with opportunities and dignity. We have expressed our solidarity with Israel and with Palestine because every life is valuable, because every death hurts us, pains us, because there is no justification at all for causing pain and death to innocent civilians. We have stated that Israel has the right to defend its population and also the overriding obligation to uphold the principles of international law and international humanitarian law as it exercises its right to self-defense. We have also rejected the use of civilians as human shields by Hamas. Ultimately, our position has been clear and has been based on international law and on the principle of defending human life and dignity. These are the principles that are guiding us on this topic and on every topic without any double standards. Colleagues, Excellencies, consistent with these principles and heeding the appeal of the Secretary General, we believe that it is essential to have a humanitarian ceasefire to alleviate the terrible situation in Gaza and diminish the risk of an extension of the violence to the region. Unfortunately, no action of this Council can return the lives lost, but we can try to avoid more suffering, more pain, and more death. Each day, every minute, every second counts, because every single life counts. I now go back to my role as President of the Council, and I would like to give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and congratulations on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. And
Shukran. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. I represent the Arab group today, and I summon the history, and I remind everyone that the United Nations, where we are speaking today, was born out of grave human suffering during the Second World War. It was established to prevent repetition of the suffering. The founders of the UN Charter have placed before their eyes the noble purpose of this organization, and the most important duty of this council, the Security Council, is as stipulated by the Charter, and I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and for these ends, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Mr. President, the Muslim and Arab worlds, and all peace-loving nations, and justice-loving nations, and every individual with a living conscience is looking towards the role of this organization and this council, in particular during this humanitarian catastrophe that is unprecedented, that has inflicted the unarmed Palestinian people. They are looking with rage and accusation, yes, accusation and criticism, because of the lack of justice and equality after the Council for 2 months has been unable to fulfill its responsibility to reach a ceasefire. And in fact, there is who obstructs the ceasefire in a precedent that will impact, if it has not impacted already, the credibility of the United Nations in addressing present and future crises. Mr. President, today is the beginning of the 3rd month of the war on Gaza, which has led until now to the death of more 17,000 Palestinian deaths who are innocent from these unarmed citizens, 70% of which who are women and children. This is a statistic that lays bare the lie of the claim that this is a war against an armed group. It is a war of collective punishment and of genocide, unfortunately, of the Palestinian people. The war has led to the destruction of more than 60% of the establishments and buildings in the Gaza Strip, and it has destroyed and damaged more than 339 education facilities, 26 hospitals, 56 health facilities, 20 water and sanitation facilities, 121 government offices, 56 ambulances, 100 mosques, in addition to targeting the United Nations itself, who was not spared the killing after more than 130 UN staff members have been killed. I would like now here, and on behalf of all the Arabs, to applaud the integrity and bravery of UN staff members, whether in the occupied Palestinian territory or at the headquarters, led by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. I applaud them for fulfilling their duties and their efforts, their honest efforts to assist the Palestinian people. And I applaud their bravery and sincerity in defending the values of this organization, despite the criminal targeting against them and the difficulties imposed by Israel, the occupying power, over their work. And despite the campaign they're suffering of defamation and terrorism, the Arab group supports you with all its might and applauds your integrity. Antonio Guterres, Lazzarini, Lane Hastings, Sema Bahouth, Martin Griffiths, Tor Winsland. We will stand in solidarity with you so long as you continue to fulfill your duties and continue to protect the values of the United Nations. Mr. President, the Arab group would like to place on record before everyone that the Israeli aggression has led to the displacement of more than 1.5 million Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. 85% of the inhabitants were forcibly displaced and forced to live in dire circumstances in the UNRWA facilities and in hospitals and elsewhere, circumstances that represent the worst of crime, wars, and crimes against humanity that clearly aim to, unfortunately, to eliminate the Palestinian people and end their cause. Mr. President, in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem as well, the settler crimes are escalating under the protection of the Israeli army. We are now before a systemic killing of the Palestinian people. In the West Bank and in East Jerusalem since October, more than 250 have been killed, martyred, in addition to many displaced persons because of the settlement expansions and the dispossession of homes and the destruction of establishments and criminal attacks by the settlers. The Arab group places on record that this aggression and this occupation also attacks Syria and Lebanon, through which they are targeting the safe villages in the south of Lebanon and the Lebanese army and the journalists who report on the facts in great danger. in a way that may lead the entire region to a wider conflict. Mr. President, the Arab Group calls on the Security Council to uphold its duties in the maintenance of international peace and security, and demands in this context to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire as per the Arab draft resolution tabled in order to end the bloodshed. This is an opportunity for the Council to save what it can after more than 60 days of the war. We also call on the Council to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Arab Emirates, the Arab member of the Council, has tabled a draft resolution, another humanitarian draft resolution, in order to increase the assistance to the unarmed Palestinians through all crossings. Mr. President, the Arab Group stresses once again that demanding a ceasefire and opening the crossings and allowing the flow of humanitarian assistance is not an act of pity or sympathy, but it is a right of civilians enshrined in international instruments and the agreed principles of humanitarian rights. It is also a political obligation and legal and moral obligation on all of us. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, the Arabs were the ones who initiated peace with Israel and for long decades have expressed their commitment to a political solution. Despite the rejection of Israel to engage with the calls for peace, and despite the repeated crimes of Israel against civilians, and despite the ideological extremism that is on the rise in Israel, the Arabs continue to commit to peace because they understand well, as people of a civilization, that violence will not lead to peace and genocide will not succeed in ending the cause of a nation, and that dialogue and peaceful coexistence are the only way for stability to be achieved in the region. This is what leads us, after ending this destructive war, to commit to resuming the political process as soon as possible in order to achieve a just and lasting comprehensive peace in the Middle East through the establishment of a Palestinian state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt, and I now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
ألقي هذا البيان باسم الدول الأعضاء بمجلس التعاون.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm making this statement on behalf of the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Sultanate of Oman, the State of Kuwait, and the State of Qatar. We are grateful to you for convening this meeting, and we would like to thank the Secretary General for his participation, which is very important in light of developments in the Gaza Strip. The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council condemn the Israeli aggression. We consider that Israel is legally responsible for its continued aggression, in particular against innocent civilians, thousands of whom have perished, mainly women and children, in flagrant violation of humanitarian law, and international law and international humanitarian law. And we refuse any justification to consider the Israeli aggression as an act of self-defense. The international community must take necessary steps in the framework of international law to react to the Israeli practices and the measures of collective punishment against the inhabitants of Gaza. We invite the international community to provide the protection to our brethren Palestinian people. We reject measures leading to the forced displacement of the inhabitants of Gaza. We condemn that the occupation forces are targeting civilian infrastructures, including schools, hospitals, and refugee shelters. Also, the occupation forces are killing journalists and are targeting international facilities, as well as the headquarters of the Qatari Committee for the Reconstruction of Gaza. The Israeli blockade contravenes international humanitarian law and Resolution 2417, which, in fact, their actions are meant to prevent the delivery of humanitarian assistance and is a policy to starve the Palestinian people. We welcome the mediation of the United States, Egypt, and others and Qatar in achieving a humanitarian truce, which led to the exchange of hostages and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We regret the end of the truce and the increase in Israeli attacks, which has led to the displacement of millions and prevents the work of numerous humanitarian and UN organizations. We welcome Resolution 2712, which calls for humanitarian truce and immediate humanitarian truces and lasting ones and throughout Gaza. We call on its immediate implementation and full implementation with a mechanism to monitor its implementation. We also welcome the measures taken by the Secretary General and his invoking Article 99 of the Charter to demand the Council to announce an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council, pursuant to the Charter, must demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and to demand the sides to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international law. We demand, on behalf of the Arab group, the immediate end of hostilities and a ceasefire, delivery of humanitarian assistance and basic necessities to all the inhabitants of Gaza, and to make sure that the delivery of assistance is done immediately, as well as the provision of water, electricity, fuel, and food. The Gulf Cooperation Council is providing emergency relief and assistance to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in addition to financial support to the United Nations and in particular to UNRWA, in light of the growing needs as well as the Israeli attacks against UNRWA facilities and UNRWA staff. We call on the international community to increase humanitarian assistance immediately in favor of UNRWA and the United Nations. The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council reiterate their unchanged position with regard to the centrality of the Palestinian question and the need to put an end to Israeli occupation, and in support of Palestinian sovereignty over all occupied territories and the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as capital. And also we support the rights of refugees in line with the initiative of the Arab states to realize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We support the initiative of Saudi Arabia and the League of Arab States in cooperation with the Egypt and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to relaunch the peace process. And we call on the Security Council to adopt a resolution in order to recognize an independent Palestinian state, which should become a fully fledged member of the United Nations. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinian people in this tragedy, and we must be intransigent and act until we achieve their full rights. Thank you very much.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of Qatar, and I now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of Bangladesh, Malaysia, Maldives, Namibia, Timor-Leste, Turkey, and my own country, Indonesia. Mr. President, in one autumn season, the world stood by and watched over 16,000 people killed in Gaza, whole families and generations wiped out, including more than 6,000 children. The latest words to describe the situation faced by innocent women and children in Gaza is apocalyptic conditions. Saying this has taken a toll in our collective conscience is an understatement. If we fail to act, history will judge us as accomplices to crimes against humanity. When the world vowed never again over 75 years ago, it was not meant only for certain race, nor for certain religious group. It was to protect everyone in this world. It was to save humanity. Mr. President, we fully support the Secretary General's recent letter to the member of this Council calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. In this very Council, on the 24th of October open debate, we underline that an immediate ceasefire is vital to end atrocities and the deteriorating humanitarian situation. This is the least that the Council should do if we truly want to uphold human rights and humanity. And this is why we are proud to co-sponsor the draft resolution on humanitarian ceasefire. We call on the Council to adopt this declaration today. In this regard, allow me to state 3 points. First, please show compassion to humanity. Focus on the innocent civilian, women, children, the infirm. How many more lives, how many more children must we sacrifice? How many more must die before the relentless assault is halted? 20,000, 50,000, 100,000? Listen to the collective plea of the global community. Stop the attack on women and children in Gaza. Let adequate humanitarian assistance into all parts of Gaza. Second, the threat of spillover of the conflict may not just be regional, but global. The situation in Gaza is being broadcast 24/7, uncensored, through social media and electronic channels. The world watches in horror as women and children become innocent casualties in this devastating conflict. We cannot afford to let radical elements take up arms in different parts of the world, or even radicalize the moderates. Lastly, let us reaffirm our commitment to uphold international law and international humanitarian law in its entirety. There must be no double standard in upholding international law and international humanitarian law, in upholding accountability. It should be applied equally to all countries, no matter big or small. There must be no double standards on humanity. For these reasons, we appeal to members of the Council, do the right thing. Stop these inhumane acts against the Palestinians. Listen to your conscience. Let us choose peace over conflict, compassion over cruelty, and unity over division. Let us work to bring peace to Palestine and Israel. Let us address the root cause and make the two-state solution a reality. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Indonesia por...
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his statement, and I now give the floor to Madam Hedda Sampson, in charge of the EU delegation of the United Nations.
The EU supports the UN Secretary General's call for the UN Security Council to act to avert the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the collapse of the humanitarian system. Urgent action is needed to ensure the protection of all civilians. The EU deplores the high number of civilian casualties killed, the majority of which are women and children. We commend the strong efforts of the UN and all humanitarian actors to deliver life-saving aid in extremely dire conditions. We deplore the death of a record number of UN staff members and other humanitarian workers who have paid the ultimate price. Full respect of international law and international humanitarian law by all sides is of paramount importance. We urge all sides to respect these principles and note that there must be accountability for violations of international law. The EU calls for the urgent implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2712 and supports its call for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days to enable, consistent with international humanitarian law, full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. The civilian population is in desperate need of more food, water, fuel, electricity, and medical care, as well as safe shelter. We regret that since the end of the humanitarian pause, the entry of humanitarian aid has declined from already insufficient levels. Access to these necessities must be urgently restored at sufficient levels to address the very high level of need, and we call for establishing additional routes to bring in life-saving aid to Gaza. The EU stands ready to continue its support, while it has already increased its humanitarian aid to more than 100 million euros. The EU and its member states will continue to work closely with international partners, the UN and other agencies, as well as countries in the region. Mr. President, there is no justification for terror. The European Union has condemned in the strongest possible terms Hamas' brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself, in line with international law and international humanitarian law. All hostages must be immediately released, and ICRC must be granted access to them and allowed to bring them required medical support. The EU continues efforts with its partners to prevent regional escalation, and we continue to engage with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, as well as other regional and international partners to this end. We call on regional actors to refrain from any action that can further aggravate the situation. The Palestinian Authority must be supported by all members of the international community, and it must be reinvigorated to ultimately return to govern Gaza as the legitimate Palestinian governance body in charge of the whole occupied Palestinian territory. Democratic Palestinian institutions based on respect for the rule of law and human rights are vital for the Palestinian people. The EU deplores the increased extremist settler violence in the West Bank and recalls that Israel has the duty to protect civilians in the West Bank, to hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure that the IDF intervenes. Furthermore, in line with the EU's commitment to implement Security Council Resolution 2334, and recalling that settlements are illegal under international law, constitute an obstacle to peace, and threaten to make a two-state solution impossible, the EU reiterates its strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions taken in this context. Mr. President, the EU underlines that the only sustainable solution that will bring security to the Middle East is peace. The European Union is ready to contribute to reviving a political process on the basis of the two-state solution, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcomes diplomatic peace and security initiatives, and supports the holding of an international peace conference soon. I thank you.
Agradezco a la excelente.
I thank Your Excellency, Madam Sampson, for your statement. There are no further speakers on the list. The meeting is adjourned.